All right, we should be live. Give some time for people to log in here. All right, already shows 16, 17, 20, 22. All right, I see the numbers increasing rapidly here. That's good to see. I'm going to wait till we had a good number because we had literally hundreds of people sign up, Kris. You're a popular guy. 34, 37. All right, this is raising quickly. So I guess I'll go ahead and we can at least start the introductions. My name is John Sherman. For anybody who's not familiar with the screening room, we're the company that's hosting this webinar with our good friend Kris Deering of Sound and Vision Magazine and Deep Dive AV. And our contact info is up there right now. The screening room is a home theater company based out of Colorado Springs for anybody who isn't familiar with us, though we do have an extensive online presence. I've written extensively on a lot of different forums and articles in various places. But it pales in comparison to what Kris has done. So I'm going to give you a little background on us and on Kris briefly as people are joining. So go to the next slide here. We are, for anybody who is in Colorado, we are the top rated AV and home theater company in the state. I'm very proud of this. I just screen grabbed this morning, 141 Google reviews, all of them 5 stars. We're very, very happy about that. And if you take some time to read through them, you'll see most people have written novels going on and on about us. So I am kind of proud of that. So that's who we are. Again, the screening room in Colorado Springs. We're known for a couple of different things I'm going to cover here just briefly. Our main claim to fame is doing comparative product evaluations under controlled conditions. This is a picture. These are a couple of pictures from a speaker shootout we did back in 2017, where we had about 22 people come in from all over the country. We had done a double-blind controlled listening test between 2 of the top speakers on the market, the Rebel Salon 2 and the JBL M2. Hid the speakers from view, precisely level matched them, position matched them, and had people rate them on a scale from 1 to 10 for sound quality. It was spread out over 2 days, and that's kind of one of the ways we made our name. Again, doing product comparisons on level playing fields, making sure that everything is equalized between products so one does not have a bias because of brand or price. And that's one of the things that we did back in 2017 on the ABS forum. It was a huge thread. And if anybody's interested, you can message me and I can send them information on that speaker shootout we did. And then Kris, there's some of Kris's background here. AV calibrator and consulting, education services. Kris, why don't you go ahead and just give a quick background on yourself?
Yeah, so my company is Deep Dive AV. I do calibration, obviously on site, and also offer remote calibration services for projectors where I can emulate somebody's setup in my lab and try to calibrate the projector here so that you don't have to wait for me to be on a tour, or if there's other things that that might prohibit me to be on site. It gives you an option there. I offer consulting. This is both for consumers and companies, whether that's just, hey, I'm building a home theater. My local AV guy that I'm buying from tells me I should buy this equipment, and I don't think that I want to get a third party that doesn't really have a stake in the game to kind of give me advice on that or anything, or just, hey, what's a good way to go about this, or anything else. Just basically just a sit down conversation where we can talk about stuff very technical or broad stroke or whatever you want. I also offer that for companies that are looking to, get insight on products, product development, or anything like that. And then education services, kind of still the same thing. Anybody that wants to basically tap into any kind of education on a technology, a product, if it's a product I'm familiar with. I do this a lot with dealers where I could come in and educate the workforce there, so that your salespeople know more about the technology that they're trying to talk about, whether that's HDR, immersive audio, projectors, flat panels, just technology in general. A lot of dealers don't seem to have a lot of a knowledgeable workforce, so I can offer that. And then I can do that for calibrators. I can do that for, pretty much anybody. So A couple other things like I said, is remote Lumagen custom configurations. I do help a little bit with the development of that product. I'm very familiar with it. So I offer a service for people that have bought one or are looking to buy one to configure it for them so that they don't have to. Most dealers don't know how to do that. So it just gives you a plug and play option. I'm a direct sales authorized dealer for both Lumagen and Panamorph. And then obviously I'm a writer for Sound and Vision. I was a writer for Home Theater Magazine before that. They merged with Sound and Vision and then took over the name. Before that, I was with Secrets of Home Theater and High Fidelity back in the DVD days. I ran the DVD benchmark after Stacy Spears left the publication, wrote for them for quite a while, quite a few years. I did a little bit of writing for Home Theater Spot before that. I've been an avid AV enthusiast for well over 20 years now. Been writing, I think, for publications for at least probably getting pretty close to 20 years now. So I've been doing this a long time. Happy to try to help people make informed decisions and give them good information.
Yep, that is absolutely true. I can vouch for all of those things. I'm just going to share here. This is something that the screening room did in conjunction with Kris back in 2019, where again, with our philosophy of leveling the playing field and making sure we're comparing apples to apples, we did a 4-projector shootout between 2 different models from JVC, 2 different models from Sony. Kris came in and calibrated both, tried to brightness match them. We did some of the comparison sighted, some of them blind, where people didn't know what projector they were looking at. And so again, it's really important to us, just like what Kris was talking about, to try to give, even though we are a dealer and we sell all these things that we're talking about, we try to be as unbiased as possible and try to do our comparisons and our events in the manner of skepticism and science, in terms of being skeptical of marketing claims. And that's one of the things I love about Kris reading his reviews. He doesn't just trumpet marketing claims. He actually investigates things to find out what's real and what isn't. So our screening room, and I'll wrap up about us and we'll just move right into the main discussion here. Our tagline is kind of, our unofficial tagline is scientifically justified high end. One of the things that we've discovered, like in our projector shootout, that a $35,000 projector didn't do as well as a $9,000 projector in most picture parameters. So the most expensive is not always the best. And even though as a businessman, I might want to try to sell somebody the most expensive thing, we try to make sure we're keeping it honest by actually doing these kind of validation tests to make sure what the information we're sharing is accurate. So moving on from there, I don't know how that still got in here. Here's Kris's, the overall, the top of the review. Kris, why don't you take it and talk about, make some opening comments here about your review and what you thought of this projector.
Sure. So the review was of the new NZ9 RS4100 for JVC. I actually got the projector in the late part of August, I want to say. Had the opportunity, JVC reached out to me, signed some forms, so I didn't get to talk about it or with anybody, but basically saying, hey, we have these new products coming out, which I, as I said in the review, was not really expecting with COVID and everything else. The last thing I was honestly expecting was new projectors this year from really anybody. Got the NZ9 in for review. The first unit that they sent me was an engineering sample. They felt that it was fairly representative of final product. They knew that there was going to be some changes. The intention was for me to review that. I declined that. I did get the unit in. It gave me the opportunity to start going through some of their new features and everything like that. But I'm very picky about my reviews. I want to make sure that if I'm evaluating anything that I'm going to be commenting on the performance of, that it is representative from a hardware and software perspective with what the end user is going to get. Now, I realize there's a ton of people that posted things using similar engineering samples, or maybe even the one that I had. I don't think so, though. That, is kind of, again, I think that those are kind of like car reviews that you see where, the manufacturer will, get these out to the, handful of people, get everybody hungry for it. start talking about these features, which, again, an engineering sample, you will be able to see all the features of it. I could test and say, yep, it does this, yep, it does that and stuff. And that's kind of what those models are really designed for, is to make sure that, everything works together and everything like that. But I did know that there were going to be, some small hardware changes. So I got very familiar with the functionality of the projector, what the advanced features were, got to evaluate a lot of things, but I wasn't going to use that for a review where I'm doing measurements and things like that. So a lot of people saw a lot of things that came out, and unfortunately, some of them did have some measurements in them. I don't really think that you should be using measurements from an engineering sample or even a pre-production sample. Simply because you just don't know if that's going to pan out. And those reviews will be there for a long time, and people will refer back to them and like, hey, why is this, that, stuff like that. So, I, more than I normally do with a review, I had access to this product for a very, very long time. Like I said, I got this in August. Here we are in December. I got a production unit, I want to say in October. It was either the end of September or the beginning of October. But even then, it wasn't, they had not finalized their firmware yet. They were still doing some minor tweaks to a couple different things on the projector. But I did know that the hardware was final hardware, which gives me the ability to start taking measurements of things like, native color performance, contrast performance, light output, and things like that. Things that I knew wouldn't change from a firmware update, especially knowing what they were still kind of tweaking on, which was mainly the laser dimming and some HDMI things. So overall, I'm sure most people here have already read the review. It's a fantastic projector. It's basically built on the NX9 platform, which I've been using as my reference. I had reviewed that before. As long as it provides the light output that you need for the screen size that you're working with, it is a fantastic projector. Excellent HDR performance, excellent just performance across the board. There's very little to complain about with these projectors. These new ones are, as I said in the review, it is built on that platform. And when I say that, I mean that the core things, the DLA chip and the lens assembly is the same. Obviously, the chassis is largely the same, just the different vents. The big differences that you're going to get here is it is completely updated from a processing standpoint. This mainly has to do with the fact that they are accepting and processing 8K video. And then the optical engine on the NZ8 and NZ9, they did a lot of things to try to reduce scattered reflections inside the optical assembly. I remember it's been a few years now, but people used to complain all the time about having a bright object on a black background and seeing it on the other side of the screen, like a ghost of it and stuff. And I mentioned in there that we used to use the Oppo the Oppo screensaver is perfect for that. It's pure white going across the black screen. And the nice thing about it is that it moves. So you see, you'll actually see where sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't. Which is nice because that kind of gives you an indicator of like, okay, if you have bright objects in this area, you might not see reflections, but you will in these areas and things like that. Where in this case, they pretty much eliminated it. I didn't see any ghosting at all, and the amount of streaking that you see from the engine is very minimal. So really, I just kind of wanted to use this opportunity to kind of talk about, any questions that anybody had about the projector, and then we can kind of go through, John and I have come up with some slides that kind of talk about the key points of the new line compared to the NX line. And I'll kind of, maybe flesh out a little bit more what my thoughts were. Whenever I write a review for Sound and Vision, as much as I enjoy doing that, I am limited by a word count. So there is some things that I might be able to elaborate more on that weren't in the review, simply because I am, I have to try to sum everything up in a word count. So,
I just wanted to point out, somebody pointed out to me, messaged me that I made a mistake on the PowerPoint. I have RS4100 NX9. It should be NZ9.
Yeah, NZ9.
Yeah, so it's the NZ9. And by the way, just real quick, the RS4100 and the NZ9 are the exact same projector. I don't know if they even had the difference in color in the lens ring anymore.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah, we usually do the 4100 because that's the Pro model, but really they're identical projector. I just want to clarify that because my slide is wrong.
Yeah. On this one, here's my pluses. My big key takeaways for the pluses and minuses. We always try to kind of do a summary of that. Um, Obviously, industry-leading HDR performance. JVC has basically garnished a reputation with their last line, and it's continued here of HDR performance for a projector. It is scene or frame adaptive. Just basically takes a lot of the onus off the end user to be able to just put in some settings and start watching HDR and deliver a picture that, you're not going to hear a lot of the same complaints of clipping or it's too dark or things like that. They've done a really nice job of balancing the incoming HDR signal for, a realistic light level that you would expect from a projector. And then with their theater optimizer, obviously they took that to the next step where you can enter in the values so that JVC kind of has a better idea of how much light they're really working with. It's one of the key components. If you're tone mapping, you need to know what you're tone mapping to, and that's hard to do. So they tried to basically, give a way to do that. And it's definitely gives the best HDR performance that I've seen from any projector on the market at the moment. There are obviously quite a few other HDR projectors out there, and some of them do a fairly good job, some of them not very good job at all. But I haven't seen anybody yet that can match the performance of the JVCs. Contrast, I said it improved over the previous flagship. That is not sequential contrast. As I said, it already still uses the same DLA chip that was in the NX9. So the sequential, the full on-off contrast, however you want to refer to it, was roughly the same. What has improved because of the optical block and the high contrast light engine is that you are seeing an increase in the mixed contrast as you work away from black. And in this case, in most cases, they doubled that. I believe in the review, it has up to the 20% ADL measurements. I actually measured up to 30%. I don't usually go much past that. But yes, they did improve that. So that's always been kind of a point of contention. People have always said they have high sequential, but not very good mixed contrast. So they did some things to try to improve that. This projector does have obviously a true 8K video input and display. Now, when I say true 8K display, that's probably where you're going to see the most of people kind of calling foul. I explained this a bit in the review, but they are showing each pixel individually. This is a lot like what you would see from DLP that uses a 4x multiplier, and even some of their 2x, because their 2x uses a higher DLP resolution to begin with, so that there's more pixels when they're only shifting twice. But each pixel is addressed and shown on screen individually. But the only caveat is there is some overlap because you're using an optical actuator, as in the chip is here, and then you have a piece of glass, and that piece of glass is what's moving it so that you see a pixel here, a pixel here, a pixel here, and a pixel here. So they're moving that and they're showing that fast enough that your eye can't differentiate, but there will be overlap because you're not physically moving this chip, and this can only move so much. What I wrote in the review is that I think that because of the pixel density of 8K and the fact that you are not doing any scaling and you are showing each pixel individually, the difference between this and a true 8K projector, I think, would be slight, if not perceptible. It's just there's so many pixels on the screen. I think as you move down in resolution, that could become more of an issue. Like if you were going from 480 to 1080, pixel gap and everything else becomes a problem. The pixels are bigger, so you're trying to move it. As you get to 4K, those pixels become smaller, as we've already seen with a lot of DLP. If you compare them to a native 4K, optically, you're really not seeing anything on screen that really looks any different. It's not until you get into test patterns that really kind of show that difference. But even with this projector, when we looked at test patterns that were from an 8K pattern generator, we didn't see any artifacts. So it rendered all of the patterns that I had available to me without any problem. And I did that actually with Jim Peterson over at Lumagen. He wanted to look at it, and he was pretty blown away by that as well.
Yeah, I remember you saying he was pretty blown away with that. If I'll ask you, Kris, how you would handle this. There's a couple of questions that came in. One of them is directly pertinent to what you were just talking about. Do you want to take that, or do you want to keep moving through?
If it pertains to a certain section, I think we already have a slide on the 8K. We can always try and, questions that we know that pertain to that we were kind of moving on.
This is more of a contrast question. So again, we can.
We're going to get to a specific section that talks about contrast. I was just going to go over this. So, and then the minuses.
Yeah. And if I could just throw this out there real quick, folks that are maybe not familiar with Zoom webinars, there's a Q&A and there's a chat. I see we're getting questions in chat and Q&A. Try to send them to the Q&A. There's a tab for Q&A and you can put your question there. And as we get through them, we can clear them and move to the next one. But like Kris said, let's get Kris through some of his initial presentation, then we'll start taking some more questions, but please put them in the Q&A section. Go ahead, Kris.
Yeah. So on the minus side, every projector has its downfalls. It's funny is, we did that comparison between the Sony and the JVC. And, in that case, we thought the JVC outperformed the Sony. And the funny thing about all of those is I always hear, kind of the pundits that kind of get upset about that say like, oh, well, that means you don't like the Sony and stuff. And you know what I mean? It's like anything else. If you compare two things, there's going to have one that has pluses, each of them is going to have their own pluses and minuses. And it's usually trying to figure out which one, is the balance that you prefer, objectively, subjectively, however you want to do it. So, all projectors have minuses, including this one. Light loss with the wide color gamut mode, my big takeaway from that is, I just think that in this day and age, as we're moving more toward 4K HDR content being pretty much the mainstay, it isn't completely, but, we're just to the point where most content now that's, new release content is being released like that. We should be shooting for wide color gamut coverage that doesn't involve light loss. It should be, it should be the standard, at least up to, the P3 portion of 2020. So I was kind of disappointed. I was hoping that we'd see maybe a light engine that didn't have any light loss or less light loss. And then the laser dimming, it is a dynamic system. I just felt that it could use a bit more refinement than it has now. I think it tried to do things in scenes that didn't really need to be done, where it's really not benefiting the black floor, but it was hurting the upper highlight area, things like that. And we'll talk about that more in the contrast section. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
This is JVC's marketing slide that we pulled in, and we told JVC, hey, we're going to be talking about this and see how well you actually hit your targets here. So did you want to comment on this one?
Yeah, I mean, just real quick. I mean, everybody's seen this. Everybody knows what the projector is. They claim 3,000 lumens. JVC, like every manufacturer, they will claim their lumen output basically at the shortest throw of the projector uncalibrated. They did meet that spec without really any problem at all. And then their other one was the 100,000 to 1. So that would be the opposite. Usually that's in the longest throw with the aperture fully closed. So they're literally working against each other. So what you won't get is a 3,000 lumen projector that does 100,000 to 1 at the same time as you're outputting 3,000 lumens. But it did meet that spec without any problems at all there either. Again, using their way of measuring. And then the only one they did not meet is the infinite dynamic contrast. These slides were made at a point where they did have firmware that did infinite. The first actually few firmwares that I got from JVC did do infinite, as in that they shut the laser off, much like they do with the RS4100. Eventually, they got to the point where now it does not shut all the way off. It does dim enough that I think most people would think that they did shut it off. You'd be hard pressed to know that they didn't until, unless it's been a long period of time where your eye is really adapted to the content, or you happen to have been watching something that was extremely dark. So your eye was already, fully, your contrast sensitivity was already extremely high to begin with. And then they went to that. But I think most people will find that in most viewing content, which isn't going to be static black all the time, that you'll actually have the perception that it did go down just simply because it goes so dark. But as of right now, it does not shut the laser off. JVC may or may not at some point do that. I'm not sure. I know that they're still looking at that, but I always tell people that buy the projector based on what it is now, not what it could be later. Outside of that, everything else is, as it is. So we can go ahead and go past this one.
All right. Somehow my old presentation, so I'm going to skip over that. I don't know if there's anything you want to, these are just the specs and the picture
No,
of it.
that's all
You
good.
notice that the back of the projector looks different for those of the people who had an RS3000 or an NX.
Yeah, the two
9.
things physically you're going to notice is just the back two panels, and then the fact that it is heavier. It is noticeably heavier when you lift it compared to an NX9.
Yeah, and technically it does not, the our chief RPA mount that almost everybody who has a JVC projector out there has, technically this is over the weight limit of that mount. Just a quick little important point.
Yeah.
Here's your test.
All right. Yeah. So, obviously I bench tested this, as you can see. Oh, I did report all the way out to 30% ADL. Okay. I didn't remember if I did or not. These are my contrast measurements. When I say native, no aperture, this was basically in the mode that I set up for my usage. I think I was not at the shortest throw. I think I'm about 30% into the optics range. So I'm at the shorter part of the throw, but I'm not at short throw. So that was basically where the projector was set up in mine and what it was. So with no aperture on, I was getting about 28,000 to 1. That's pretty in line with what I see from most NX projectors. I've calibrated lots of them. Obviously, there are always going to be little variations because different throw distances, different angles, and things like that. But generally, I think the lowest I've ever measured is maybe 24,000 to 1. And I've measured all the way up as high as about 30 into the low 30s because, as much as people think the throw range of these projectors in most setups tend to always be about the same. I don't know what it is. Like most people's rooms really don't have where they're going really far out or things like that. So, and then obviously in the same throw, I got up to 97,000. I actually got higher than that when I did my full testing, where I did the adjustment, and that was 123,000 to 1. So the highest contrast I could measure from this projector in the longest throw was 123,000 to 1. And at shortest throw, and that was with everything closed down, apertures, no dimming. And then without the apertures closed at max throw, I was at 51,000 to 1. So quite a bit of contrast there. You can see the dynamic modes obviously increase that exponentially, but you'll also notice that as you go down, as you go farther up in ADL, that actually makes the contrast go worse.
It gets worse.
And that's because of the way that they're doing their dimming. So they're taking away the top end and, at the same time as the bottom. So you're losing contrast in that sense. So again, you're going to see a big difference in terms of the black floor when you get to something that is near black or almost all black. But it does start to hurt the image as you start to move away from that. And again, I don't know how much the numbers really show it, but you really will notice it in highlight detail and some of the bright things. Like if you were looking at a star field, it would be, the blacks might be slightly better, but then you're missing about half the stars on the screen and things like that. That's a lot of the reason that I said that I personally don't like to use it. I would really like to see the dimming system only work with black, like a full blackout. It's really the only time I missed it is in a full blackout. But I mean, if you think about how video works, that's incredibly hard to do because there's so many coming in and out of fades and things like that, where, it's like you don't want to have it where it's jumping from one to the other. So, trying to find that balance is extremely hard. So that would be quite the task. So, and with that, I would just tell JVC, well, keep working on native contrast, then you don't need a dynamic one. So
yeah, well, that's the whole thing, is once they get to perfect black, who cares, right? So
exactly. All right, let's go ahead and
do the next one.
Yeah, so there's someone. So I think I saw this first one that he talks about. He says that, hey, great review. Obviously, ADL is doubled. What do you say to upgrade from the NZ9 from the E-Shift series? Now, the E-Shift series did have a higher sequential contrast, but the problem there is that most people are looking at the wrong contrast number. So sequential contrast on the E-Shift projectors was higher. They could also be more aggressive with their iris. And I think that had to do with the way the lens worked too. There was a different stop on that lens when I talked to JVC engineering. But most of the contrast that people quote when they go, oh, I'm going from this number to this number, they're talking about a usage situation that most people don't have, which is, again, the aperture is fully closed. I don't think I've ever had a client ever that runs of any JVC with the apertures fully closed. I realize there might be some outliers and stuff, but that's really not the normal use. Now, when you start talking about more open aperture, the difference between the two starts to become a little bit smaller. Like I said, I'd say the average for the NX line tends to be in the high 20s to about 30,000 to 1. What I usually see from the E-Shift series, the RS series from before, I usually see right around 38 to 40,000. And then obviously as you start closing down the aperture, it goes up from there, and it goes up faster with those. So yes, they do have a better sequential contrast than these models do. The thing is that almost everybody I know that's gone from one of those, including myself, to the newer models, generally finds that the contrast difference it's there, but unless you are comparing them side by side, I don't know how much it would really impact your viewing. It's really obvious to see that stuff side by side in like a direct comparison because our eyes are amazing optical comparators. But when you went from one projector and then like the next day you got another projector and you put it in and you don't have that other one to actually look at, when you're talking about these differences, it's not as high. A lot of times you need to have like, a bigger exponent for moving from one contrast to another. So yes, you do lose it. Yes, there's some scenes that, again, even with this projector, the black floor isn't as good as I would want it to be when you're not, using the dynamic or anything like that. But I don't think it's probably as big of a difference as some people might be scared of it being. But, in this case, with this projector, especially because you have so much more light to work with than you did with the old E-Shift series, the fact of the matter is that even if you were using the mid laser, you would be able to clamp the iris down enough that you would probably be at or exceed the contrast that you had before natively, because you now have more light to work with to clamp the iris down with.
Right. So you can utilize the iris and get the contrast boost, right? I just wanted to throw in, just from my own personal experience, having, Kris has seen tons of these. I've seen a ton of them and have had them all in my own theater, because whatever wins our shootouts goes in my house, which is a nice little perk. But we end up sponsoring a lot of film events in Colorado Springs here for filmmakers and stuff, and they have an old RS540 that I think we put in. And yeah, I can tell that the black is a little bit better when I go down and watch films on that, but I can't. The question was, would somebody be satisfied with the contrast level of the new projectors? Since I put in an RS3000 in here and I plan to get the 4100, I never once said, oh man, I gave up so much. Like you said, most of that would be only if you saw them side by side. So
yeah, but again, you have the opportunity here to probably set it up where, if that was providing enough light for you, you'd be able to use one of these, clamp the iris down, and get the same amount of light with probably more contrast than you had at that time.
Exactly. So, that's an important point.
Yeah. So, so that answered that one. Filter. So yeah, we'll go over these next ones when we get to those kind of slides. Let's go to the next slide, since we've kind of talked about the contrast ratio stuff.
Yeah, this is the high contrast optical block. Do you want to stay on?
Yeah, so as I said, they did, I don't like the way that's I don't know if JVC did that, but on-off contrast, sequential versus mixed contrast, ANSI. So this is a beef that I have, and I know people have, had issues with me in the past when I say ANSI doesn't matter. ANSI contrast is not, in my opinion, mixed contrast. ANSI is a very specific set. It is a test pattern that is designed for a specific contrast measurement. And ANSI is a 50% ADL, which basically is, the big 8 squares, big white, big black, big white. The problem I have with ANSI is that it really is not representative of real content. And I've talked to people about this before, where they go, oh, well, it's mixed contrast, so it's more representative of contrast than sequential contrast is. And I agree, sequential contrast in itself is not representative because it's only white and it's black, but it is telling you the total dynamic range of that system, including the black floor, which means that any contrast or any level that you have past that will never be lower than that floor. So if your floor is already high, it doesn't matter what your contrast is at other levels because you're starting high to begin with. It's a lot like a noise floor in a room. If it's really loud, it doesn't really make that much difference how much you have as you go higher because it sets the baseline all the time. ANSI contrast represents something that really isn't in real content. It makes more sense if you're talking about something where you wanted to use it for an Excel spreadsheet. And I always say that because that's probably pretty close to a 50% ADL. If you actually, it's, and at that point, the other thing that with contrast that, again, I've been doing contrast testing for well over a decade. And I've done so many comparisons with high ANSI projectors versus high sequential projectors and things like that. That the other thing, when you get towards 50% ADL or really higher than probably 20 or 30% ADL, is that when, if you're talking about the extremes of contrast, when we measure ADL contrast, we're measuring a white and a black, but now we're measuring it with different ADL. So the pattern will have white squares to bring up the ADL of the image. And then you're still just measuring the center, the black and the white, the black, then the white, and you're adding more white squares to make the ADL go higher. But that's not how really, that still tells you at any ADL what the max contrast would be. But you have to think about mixed images and things like that. When you start getting to a 20 or 30% image with real content, there's very little black on the screen. It's you're getting to the point where it's like maybe a snow field with like little maybe black trees or little bits of rock that you see on the mountain itself and stuff. And the way our eye works, our contrast sensitivity changes drastically as you come out of black. This has been talked about, if you just sat in a black room for 10 minutes with your eyes open up and bias and your contrast sensitivity goes way up. You start to see things in the room and things. But if you have a lot of light hitting your eye, your contrast sensitivity goes down. And that's why a lot of people, you'll see that number going around that our eye only has about 1,000 to 1. Well, I don't really think that's true, but what they're talking about is that, at normal stimulus, you're probably only going to see about 1,000 to 1. So when you get to these high ADL scenes, there's not enough, the little bits of black that are on there, your eye is cueing, like basically keying in on it versus the white or the things around it. And that black looks black. It's like, it's why, projectors that have really poor sequential contrast will look like they have super dark inky blacks and other things because, the black is now being like right next to a bright white or a bright red or something like that, that gives your eye something to say, hey, I can compare it to this and look at that looks really black compared to that and stuff. Where when you're talking about when you're getting near sequential, now you're talking about a scene that probably has almost nothing for your eye to bias to. So you're looking at something that's very, very black with like maybe a tiny little thing in the corner or there's no bright objects and it's just black and maybe some gray fog, like the Game of Thrones stuff. Well, if your eye has nothing to key in on, it has nowhere to hide. That black floor has nowhere to go. All you're seeing is the limitation. And so that's why I always say that sequential really, there's a lot of other reasons sequential is important, but it's way more obvious when you have low sequential than it is when you have low mixed. I'm not saying that mixed contrast isn't important. All contrast is important. I'm just saying that when you start looking at content and things and the way our eyes work to it, you are going to notice deficiencies in sequential long before you notice the other ones. Just look at the evolution of displays in general. Start looking at plasma and things like that. Start looking at all these flat panels that had extremely high, mixed contrast already. And what did they do? They kept on making their black floor better and better and better and better. Almost every display technology, what are they always pushing? You never see display technologies going, we've increased the mixed contrast. Isn't it amazing? It's always, they're trying to get that floor down because it benefits all contrast as it goes up, because the lower you start, the more contrast you have through there, the better it is for gamma, the better it is for so many different things. Now, again, it's not trying to belittle the other ones, but ANSI in general, I don't really agree with it 50%. It's just, again, it just doesn't represent anything that we're looking at. That's why my ADL measurements really only go to like 20 or 30%, because after that part, your perception of contrast is just so changed. Now, there's other elements like MTF and things like that, and ANSI might be, part of that, where it's, how good the optical engine is at differentiating pairs and things like that. But I've also just got to the point where I think that unless it's really bad, you're not going to really notice the difference between the two that much. Again, especially with moving objects and video and everything like that. So I do like that they did increase the contrast as you're coming out of black. That's definitely noticeable, and everything like that. It also makes it where it's just not a talking point anymore, because there's always just been that debate of like, well, what if it did have this? Or now you have kind of the best of both worlds. But I would still like to see them increase contrast. So if JVC is listening, please increase your sequential contrast. I'd like it to be like the Christie eclipse and just be infinite, and then we don't have to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, and just to put that in perspective, right, too, it's still, other than the eclipse, there really isn't anybody else out there that's even
not in the projection space.
No, not in the projection
Sim
space.
Sim 2 had their duo. It does pretty well. It's a dual projection system. Right. They do it dynamically, and it does have pretty good contrast. I haven't really had the chance to evaluate one of those in person, but again, that was kind of a one-off. I don't think that there's more than a handful of those even in existence. Yeah. But yeah, for right now, this is what it is.
I put on the ANSI next to mixed contrast, so you would have the opportunity to expound upon that like you just did.
Nice. Yeah, I could get on a rant on that. All right, let's go to wait a minute. Does the improved ADL numbers help darken the side pillar boxes? That's a good question. I don't think I evaluated that. So I don't know. I imagine it would help. Because you're not going to get quite as much wash into the image as you did before. So I think you're going to have to just wait and see what people think subjectively about that. I use a scope screen, so I don't really see black bars that often. But it should help with that. Should make the blacks a little bit better in that regard. But I didn't test for that directly. Sorry. I didn't see anything else on that. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next one.
I missed that. I didn't see that question in there, but
yeah.
So that's just on the laser light source.
Here's another one that's contrast. Sorry for Sev. Sony laser projectors contrast is at its maximum at 100% light output. Does the contrast change with the NZ line? No, it does not. So the Sonys are a little peculiar in that. Now the GTZ 380 doesn't do that. It actually maintains contrast as you change the laser light output. The lower line, pretty much the 1025 and lower, as you lower it, contrast suffers. I don't know why it would be different between the GTZ and those, but it is. The other issue that the Sony has is that if you put up, and I'm sure if you look at my measurements for the Sony reviews, if you have as much as a single pixel up on the screen, and I actually had Stacy Spears make a pattern for this that's on the Spears and Munzel disc, if anybody ever wants to look at it. In the contrast section, you'll see one that says single pixel. You put a small white pixel, 1 pixel up in the corner, which really shouldn't affect any measurement. It's way off in the corner and it's only a single pixel, but it does affect the Sony ones as well. So it has to do something with the way they're driving their voltage, I imagine. So like in their case, theirs usually ends up right around 18 to 20,000 to 1 native. But as soon as you put a pixel on the screen, it drops to about 12,000 to 1, which means that in any real situation, you're never going to get better than 12,000 to 1. So that does hurt their dynamic range. The NZ line, at 1, a single pixel doesn't affect it. And no, I did not see anything as you went from low, medium, or high for their contrast ratio. There is a small amount of change because your upper end changes just a little bit, but it was marginal to the point where it's not an issue at all.
So Sev had another question that accidentally got sent to answered, but it's more about P3 color output. You want to come back to that one?
Yeah, because we're gonna bring up a slide for that. Okay. So the laser light source, as everybody knows, this is, I want to say their it's third generation. The second generation was the one in the RS4100. This uses a different diode, but it does have the same output. The biggest things here is that, yes, it has the same output as the 4500. Great. It's a smaller design. It is very, to say that it is, the heat output of this is noticeably different. The 4500 I had for a long time in my room, and it was basically a big heater. It would heat up the room pretty fast. And even the NX line, the heat coming out of those, you know, if you turn on an NX projector, bulb-based projector for, I mean, God, 3 to 5 minutes and put your hand on the front at the exhaust, it's hot air. I mean, it's not warm, it's hot.
Yeah.
With these, not only are you getting the higher light output, but that air is like lukewarm at best. It's really surprisingly cooler than you get with the NX line and what I remember from the 4500 line. And then the other real benefit of this is it is a lot quieter. In high laser, I was getting, you know, my decibel readings were well below, you know, nowhere near what you get with a 4500. They were actually lower than what I get from the NX line in high lamp, and in the mid and low are exactly the same noise level. There's no difference between the two, and they were both quieter than the low lamp in the NX line. So
That's
yeah,
particularly exciting to me because
yeah. And John, you had the opportunity. I had you, you know, you came in and looked at it, and I think you said the same thing. Like I think when you came and looked at it, I had it in high laser the entire time you were there, and it was sitting with
whisper
and
quiet.
it was like right on a table right behind your head. It wasn't even mounted on a ceiling or anything like that, and it is pretty unbelievable how quiet it is, that it's really easy to tune out because it's just an air rushing noise too. It's not really a mechanics.
It may sound silly, but that's one of the things I'm most excited about, because I have a 4100 coming here, and that's one of the things I'm most excited about. I mean, there's other things too in the laser light engine, but the 3000 I have up there now, which is the NX9, it's noticeable as primarily an audio guy. I am very excited about the much quieter projector as soon as it gets here.
Yep. Okay, let's go next one. All right, E-shift. So I kind of already, you know, talked about this. You can see from their diagram, it does a pretty good job that this one, you know, the E-shift that was in the RS3000 was a two-way shift, and it didn't accept an 8K signal. So basically all you were ever doing was just scaling 4K up to 8K, and you really weren't getting to 8K. You were getting about halfway to 8K. So you should have seen a little bit of MTF change, but really not that much. This one, you know, you can actually take an 8K signal, it'll shift it 4 different directions, so each pixel is addressed individually. There is no scaling involved at all. It is a pure pass-through device with an 8K signal. Now, the question then becomes, and I talked about it in the review, is 8K a marketing thing or not? So I break down 8K in terms of resolution as more of a marketing thing. I don't, again, like if you were to sit down at a normal seating position with almost any screen size, and you put up a Nyquist single pixel pattern for 4K where it's one single pixel on, one single pixel off, most, I would say probably more than 99.9% of people would not be able to see that pattern has an on pixel and an off pixel. It will look gray. I have 2010 vision, and from my for my far vision and from my seat, I can't see Nyquist at 4K. Now, the other thing there is that even if you're watching 4K material, the odds that anything other than a desktop or like a spreadsheet or a static test pattern image, nothing you watch with motion will ever be at 4K resolution to begin with. That's what I kind of put in the review. I think he might have edited that a little bit, but I basically said that when you're watching 4K content, whether it's a video game, a movie, a TV show, you're not seeing 4K resolution anyway, because the motion of the camera capture and everything, you're just not getting that resolution like you would be in a static pattern. The other thing is that almost everything that we watch is compressed. And if you know anything about compression, one of the very first things that they do is they usually use some kind of high pass filter to just take away that high frequency, because they know you're not going to see it anyway. So they get rid of that because it makes the compression easier to do. So the benefit to me here is that you now have more pixels for what you had. So one, you are going to have more resolution at any one time on the screen, regardless of where it is. It doesn't have to be near Nyquist. Everything is being represented by more pixels. But the key benefit that I noticed is that if you are somebody that likes to use any kind of image enhancement, any kind of scaling, any kind like that, you are now spreading that, anything that you're adding to the image, because you are, if you're putting any kind of enhancement in or anything like that, And then scaling, you're now, every pixel is now a quarter of the size that it was before. So it's less likely for you to notice any of the, the shortcomings of the scaling, the shortcomings of any kind of image enhancement stuff. You can actually be a little bit, more aggressive with those things and things like that. So from a standpoint of having more headroom to work with in terms of pixels to do any kind of processing and stuff, it's there. I've demonstrated it to a couple people already where I, turn it on and off. Now, if you just are turning it on and off, the difference is subtle. It's when you start adding other things in that you notice that you don't notice them as much when you have it on than when you have it off. So, so yeah, it's just, do I like it? Yes. Would I recommend it's on? I see a couple people saying, hey, should I use this? I would say yes. I can't think of a single, I have tested it for months now, and I have not had a single situation where I wanted to turn it off. I'm not finding anything that hurts the image in any way. And in every usage case that I've had, I've left it on and been very impressed. And I'm somebody that doesn't typically like having image processing things on, but I do like the way the image looks. It still looks great if you turn it off. I'm actually glad that JVC didn't do a native 8K projector, because we don't really have 8K content. And if you have a native 8K projector, then you have no option. You're always processing the video coming in. And, if you're trying to be a purist or whatever else, that you don't have that option anymore. I like that they gave you the option to just, if you don't want to use it, turn it off. If you want to use it, you can use it. I think most people will probably agree once they've had some time with it, especially like in the beginning, it's like, oh, I don't really see that. Just spend some time with it. You'll start to notice the difference. But my biggest, descriptor for that, I've tried over the time of just looking at things. It's just everything looks a little bit more resolved, a little bit sharper in terms of like edges and things like that. But the other thing is like the image really imparts, and I saw another reviewer, it's funny, is I saw another reviewer say the same thing, and I had said it to a friend of mine a few days before, is it really reminds me of having frame interpolation on. When you have frame interpolation on a projector, I'm not a big fan of frame interpolation. JVC calls it clear motion drive. You just have that sense of a little bit more clarity, a little bit more depth of image and things like that. But there's always the motion, because now they're inventing fake frames. So everything kind of has that weird motion to it, the soap opera effect or whatever you want to call it. And I hate that. I see it immediately. It distracts me. This gives you a lot of the benefits that you see from frame interpolation, where it just, you have more motion resolution and things like that, but without the motion artifacts of it.
Without
so
that ultra smooth.
That's what it kind of reminds me of, is that it just kind of gives it that more solidity. The motion looks a little bit better and everything, but without having the weird funkiness that you see from a frame interpolation system. So
there's a question here, if I can throw it out there, about the E-shift being on. The question is, do we need the 100mm lens to really take full advantage of it?
I'm not sure on that. Obviously, I haven't gotten, I did not have a chance to look at a 3100 at the NZ8. So I'm not sure, what the difference would be subjectively looking at, from the 100mm versus the other lens. Obviously, I don't know. Then, and it doesn't just come down to that. It's like, well, how far are you sitting? How big is the screen? And everything like that. The normal glass lenses on the JVCs are very, very good. You do see a little bit of chromatic aberration. I think a lot of that kind of comes down to how much of the lens you're using versus, the other one. You obviously have a bigger lens with 100mm, so there's less chance of it, being out at the extremes of the lens than the other one. But I can't answer the question on, do you have to have that to have it? Obviously, they put it on the other one until I see it. I'm not sure, but I'm sure, as more of these get into people's hands, we'll start seeing, people kind of chime in on that and hopefully give some decent.
And if I can just kind of throw out there too, I mean, that was when we did our, it's the same lens between the NX7 and the NX9 previously. And when we did our shootout, we spent 2 days looking at those sequentially and hiding one and then showing the other. There was, to me, it wasn't so much there was more detail with the larger lens, but there was also a greater sense of depth in darker scenes. There were other things that bigger lens did better. I think would be more dramatic improvements than, resolving maybe some of this 8K stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially I had the NX9 in here for a long time, put the NX7 in here for about 2-3 weeks, and I definitely noticed a difference in what I keep calling the purity of the image, the depth, the three-dimensionality of the image, but I didn't see a whole heck of a lot of difference in sharpness. So anyway, that was just my 2 cents.
Okay. Let me see. Color, HDR. We talked about the other
There's
lens.
a question in chat that's kind of bridges some of this. Well, it's a color related. There's a question that ended up in chat instead of Q&A, so I just want to make sure we don't miss it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's another one here. There's, other than pixel pipping is
he
the
moved
100
it over
millimeter
to
lens.
Q&A. Sorry.
Yeah,
sorry.
worth the additional 10,000. I can't answer that question. Everybody's, whether or not, is it a better lens? Yes. Is it $10,000 better? I don't know. Like, my impression of $10,000 is different than other. I mean, I see people talking about things that I'm just like, I can't believe that this is being discussed when you're talking about the price differences of stuff. Again, I think that JVC's standard glass lenses are very, very good. And in most cases, probably enough for most people. If you want to know that you got the best lens that they offer, go with the NZ9. I doubt that you will be disappointed with an NZ8 or an NZ7. There's going to be definite differences between the 7 and the 8 and 9 because the 7 doesn't have the high contrast block and things like that. It also doesn't have the same E shift. So they've done, some stuff to differentiate those. You don't have the color filter and things like that. But, is the lens worth that? I mean, I could say the same question where I believe the Sony lens on the 1025 versus the one below that, I think it's a $20,000 delta. And the only difference between those is the lens. So, there's going to be some people that are just like, hey, I want to have this. I like the lens. I'm planning on putting an NZ9 in my room, but I can't answer that question, specifically for somebody else.
Yeah. And if I just going to piggyback what I said a little while ago, having had the previous version, the NX7 versus the NX9, I definitely saw when we did our big shootout, and that shootout's on our website, the one that Kris did with us a couple of years ago, where we get into detail between the 7 and the 9, or the 2000 versus the 3000 is the numbers I usually think about. But if you look at that, we talk about that, and we were looking at some clips from Alien, the 1979 film Alien, that were some of the dark scenes where Harry Dean Stanton was walking around, and there was definitely a difference in depth and dimensionality with the better lens. But is that $10,000? Like Kris says, that's such a personal call,
Yeah.
So
yeah, for sure. We don't really need, we already talked about the 8K, this was just JVC slide that basically showing, hey, look at, here's a source that was 4K 120. You can see that we accepted it and stuff. And really the only sources out there, I mean, if you have a PC, I know you can put some 8K content and 4K 120 content into there. It's really not kind of a mainstay consumer source. For consumer sources, you have the Xbox and the PS5. I don't know if either of them are doing 8K. I think they're both doing 4K 120 at this point. And I think even that's limited to, only some games or something. So
yeah,
kind of already talked about the high contrast optical block. So yeah, it is definitely not a marketing thing. As you see the measurements, it definitely increased the contrast. They also say that it has an increase in light output. Obviously, I couldn't test that because I didn't have an NZ7 or an NZ8 to look at if there was differences there. Kind of talked about the lens. So the home theater optimizer, according to JVC, they are using the same algorithms for HDR processing between the NX and the NZ9, the NX line and the NZ line. The big difference here is that obviously they have more light to work with. So, the tone map will be different in that respect because it has more range if you plan to use the full amount of output of the projector. They've also done it now where the setup menu is a little bit clearer. It shows, you put your screen size and it says specifically the diagonal, so that there's no like, do I put the width of the screen? Do I put this? You put the diagonal, and then it also has where you tell it what screen, aspect ratio you have. So it'll ask if you have a 16:9, if you're using a scope, or if you're using a 17:9. So there is differences there in how you do the setup. And then the old theater optimizer mode in the NX didn't have an auto mode. It was low, medium, and high for how much compression you're using for the tone map. Where the new one has an auto and then five levels. So from -2, so -2, -1, 0, +1, +2. So it has more latitude to work across. So you have a little bit more granularity. And then it has an auto mode where it's basically picking that based on the information it has and what it's analyzing. And I thought it did a really good job. I saw some people in here asking a little bit about how it compares with something on HDR plus versus HDR. So HDR plus only really applies to a small amount of content. There's some, I think, on some Amazon streaming has it. And then there's some discs out there that have it from Universal and Warner. I did try to do a few comparisons with the content I have. I just didn't really see any difference between the two, nothing that really stood out. The HDR10 Plus has a few limitations. It doesn't use the color filter because I imagine they said, hey, we want to have as much light as possible. It also does not have the auto mode. So it's more like the old theater optimizer where it's a low, medium, and high on how much compression you want. So do you want it to lean more toward brighter and less dynamic, or more dynamic and dimmer? That's really going to be, ultimately up to the person. I would just say, hey, if you're buying one of these and you have some of that content, just, it doesn't hurt to try it between both of them. I just didn't see enough difference between the two. I like that they added the feature. It's always nice to have that opportunity to look at different things, but ultimately, I don't think people are going to really see a lot of difference between the two. And then I also saw somebody ask, how does the dynamic tone mapping compare to the Lumagen? I'm sure most people know, I use Lumagen in my room. Surprisingly, it held up really, really well, but it always, since they got to the theater optimizer, it does perform very, very well. It's a very good tone mapping solution. The Lumagen is different in some regards. One, you can, there is no approximation. You're telling it exactly how much light. If you're setting it up properly, it knows exactly how much light it's working with. So it's still a little more granular than what you get from the JVC. I think for most run-of-the-mill content, they are more similar than different. Where you really start to see them separate from each other is something that's extremely dark or extremely bright. That's where I think the Lumagen starts to pull ahead. I noticed it a lot in some content that's really dark, like the opening sequences from Black Panther. I know people have complained about those in the past because they're so dark. I thought those looked quite a bit better and more resolved with the Lumagen versus the JVC. And then super bright stuff like some of the scenes in the Meg and Starship Troopers is another one that has some really bright stuff. It doesn't have kind of a processed look to it. It looks a little more natural in skin and some other things in these really high bright situations where it still looks like it's being like almost overexposed or kind of, I don't know, kind of grainy and gritty looking with the JVC. But again, I think, this is getting into, is it nitpicking? Yes. I mean, every time I've demonstrated to somebody, it's been pretty obvious, but, it still does a really, really good job. I hope to see them continue to refine it. I'd like to see them offer something where maybe they have like a hidden menu or a calibration menu where you can just put the raw values in so that they're not even guessing with their theater optimizer. It's just, hey, here's the measurement. But it still does a really good job. So
I put this slide back up here just for a quick second. I thought I sent this to you, Kris, but this is some information I got from JVC Factory. We haven't had the ability to confirm any of this, but this is new information from JVC that they're sharing for anybody who out there is a gamer. They're claiming the latency spec for 4K 60p and low latency mode, which of course turns off the frame adapt HDR tone mapping. But when you turn on low latency for gamers, they're saying under 25 milliseconds, saying even slightly better than that with 4K 120p. This seems counterintuitive unless Kris has an explanation for it. They're claiming 8K 60p is under 10 milliseconds of latency.
So I know that they are claiming that if you turn eShift on, latency goes down. I had a Meridio generator that was
As in improves, right? Yeah.
yes, because their refresh rate's faster. Um, so I tried to do latency measurements. Some people had asked about it. I put out a thing to Meridio. They sent me a thing that was supposed to help with it, and the measurements didn't seem very consistent, and I couldn't do 4K 120 or 4K or 8K with it. So I didn't put them in there. I just didn't feel confident enough in the measurements to do it. I'm not sure how JVC is measuring their latency. They have some kind of test rig of their own, but unfortunately, that's just not something that I can verify. Most of my measurements were in the 30s when I did my measurements, but I would change some things and it wouldn't change. So I just wasn't that confident in the test rig. So I don't, it's just one of those things that I don't want to give bad numbers.
Right. Yeah. That's what coming out of JVC factory. So we just wanted to pass that on as information that.
Yeah, there's enough gamers out there and probably some people that have ways to measure it that, might be more consistent than what the rig that I had, that I'm sure after a little bit of time, we'll start getting people chiming in about it once they get these out there in the field. So I just say, hey, keep a lookout for gamers that are measuring that.
So I put up the color space slide here because we do have some questions about, unless you have something else you want to directly address first, but there's some color space questions here. Was the 87% DCI-P3 without the filter surprise given the higher values with the NX series? And do you expect that this figure will be typical for other samples of NZ9s? How visible is the 87% versus the higher percentage?
Well, hold on real second. I want to,
there
was a couple more questions that had to do with HDR. So we got, for your review, you used high laser for HDR. No, I didn't. I did try high laser, but on my screen, I used mid laser for actually both HDR and SDR. I didn't really see the point in using low laser. So I used mid laser already gave me more light than I was getting from my NX series before, and going higher, I didn't feel the need to do it. So I did test, for a while in high laser, but I just used mid laser. It gave me plenty of light. I could even use the aperture and things like that. So ultimately, which laser level you decide on is really going to be a personal choice. Obviously, you're going to have to use whatever one delivers the amount of light that you're looking for, in your room. And then obviously, if you wanted to go higher than that, you could take advantage of the fact that you could close down the aperture and things like that. And, so it's just a balance of, is it bright enough for you? Is it too bright? Do you want to try to increase native contrast by closing the aperture down? Do you want to use the filter, the color filter, so you might need to use more light for that to compensate for the light loss of that. As far as, do I think you should, I think somebody asked, should you use the filter or should you use that light for this? Again, different strokes for different folks. Having, more color gamut coverage is great, but at the same time, how much content in any one scene is using that, it's all towards the upper edges of the gamut. Yes, there's content that goes there. How much of the content you're watching goes there? How often would you notice it? You probably would notice it if you were doing a side-by-side. How much you would just notice it in casual? I don't know. I can't answer that question. If you have the light available, I don't see any reason why not to use the filter, but I don't think that it's going to be something that it's like, a huge difference between the two. With most content, again, unless you were trying to specifically compare something side by side or things like that. Would you notice the color difference more than the contrast? I don't know, because depending on how much you're closing down the aperture is going to change the contrast level. So it might be it's a 30% loss. So with the filter, so if you gained that 30% back and then close the aperture down, you probably could move, contrast up quite a bit. So, I would probably venture to say that you would probably notice the contrast difference more than the color difference. But, everybody's a little different in their sensitivities to that. It's hard to answer for, generalization with that, because everybody's a little different on what they kind of key in on an image. Some
Yeah,
people
and
are,
if I could just throw in real quick, just like you said, it's a personal thing. I've been mixing a couple of short films here recently, but also assisting with color grading. And when you're doing the color grading work, I definitely notice a difference in the color gamut. So, but I'm keying on that because that's something I'm critically looking at that moment, and I can see the difference.
are you grading at what, P3?
Yeah, P3.
So what are you comparing though? Are you comparing a 709 monitor to a P3 monitor? Or are you comparing like
No,
a
just
monitor that's
even
90% versus 100%?
just putting some of the raw footage or the color time footage up on the projector, and then you're looking at it with or without the color filter in place.
Oh, yeah.
And see those differences and the reds and the greens. And when we did our shootout, when you were out here too, we were taking it in and out and comparing like the Sony, but the Sony seems to have, do you remember what's the Sony coverage of P3?
So the other thing you have to be careful of, with JVC is, especially this isn't always the same, but, you're saying like, okay, if I'm looking at content at your house with your projector and you're going in and out of the filter, the problem is that JVC has all these calibration basically blocks inside that projector. And if you calibrate it, if you have undone the factory work, which is what I did in your room with the filter in place, when you take it to the filter out, it's a completely different calibration. Well, it's a completely different calibration table. So now it's not only, you're not just changing color, you're changing, probably the accuracy of the white point, a bunch of other stuff. So it's not, you would have to have calibrated both from using the factory work and then comparing them so that really the only thing changing is the gamut and nothing else. So that's kind of, again, if you're trying to be very objective about the comparison of the two, you have to kind of be careful with that because the way they store their profiles.
Well, that's something I did not know. So that is good information for me. Just going through some of the other questions here.
Okay, so I'm just going to start back at the top. How does the dynamic laser dimming on the 9 compare to the 4500? I did not have the chance to compare them directly. I did like the 4500 worked really good. The thing with the 4500 is that it has a third of the native contrast of the NZ series. So you needed the dynamic laser a lot more with that projector than you do with this one because the black just wasn't that good. It's around 8 to 10,000 to 1. I mean, it's not bad contrast. It's better than a lot of other things out there, but from a JVC standpoint, that's pretty low. So, especially if you were going from, like any other JVC projector to the 4500, it was a pretty drastic drop in contrast. You're talking about the RS line, now you're talking about like 4 times the native contrast. So with that, the laser dimming was really necessary. It still had problems. It would black out too easily. Like if the content went low enough in ADL, it would just black out. That was always kind of annoying. There was other little things about it. You'd see some transitions here and there. I mean, it works pretty well. I think for most people, I'm really, really picky about video. Most people will be really happy with it. But I think that most people that see this will like it. It's, again, it really comes down to subjectively how picky you are about video. Most of the artifacts that I see from the laser dimming on this are very reminiscent of tone mapping artifacts when you're kind of clamping the top end and you're losing detail and things like that. And because I helped Lumagen with the development of their tone map, I'm extremely sensitive to tone mapping artifacts. Like it's something that I just look for all the time because I spent so much time trying to, fine tune a tone map solution. So because it's the same thing, I key in on it like that, where I think other people might be like, I don't even know what you're talking about, so I think it's just one of those things that, people are going to have to try it for themselves. I only miss having it in a blackout. But in any like normal content, as long as it doesn't go to a black screen, I just don't really see enough benefit compared to the other things for me personally to use it. So there's that one. Was the 87% DCI without the filter a surprise given the higher values of the NX series? No, because I've measured other blue phosphor projectors before and they tend to be, 90 to just below 90. It's a different light technology. It's using, different polarizers and things like that. So the bulbs have, I mentioned in there, the bulbs have a higher native color coverage than the blue phosphor projectors do. This is another reason why I was kind of hoping that JVC would have moved to maybe like a dual color, like a red and blue diode, where we can get a higher gamut coverage without the need for a filter and things like that. So now the question becomes, are you going to notice the difference between, 87 to 90% versus 90 to 93% if you were using an old one before that didn't have a filter? Probably not. I mean, it's just so small, but you may, I think there would be a more dramatic difference between the filter on and the filter off than there is going to be between looking at one projector that didn't have a filter versus another one that didn't have the filter and stuff like that. But again, ultimately, I would like to see JVC and every other manufacturer get to the point where we, this isn't even a question anymore. It's like the native gamut's 100% P3 at least, and we're not losing any light, and we don't even have to have this discussion. So why do reviews never show pixel peep photos, especially with $10,000 lenses and new eShift? I work for a publication that isn't really geared specifically toward the tweaky kind of, hardcore enthusiast. So I have to balance my review. If I was writing for like Secrets of Home Theater and High Fidelity, like I was before, where it's, internet based, really hardcore enthusiast, stuff, I would be more into that. In this case, again, I just don't think that the majority of readers are going into that level, because you're never going to do that in real life. I mean, who watches their projector like, oh, I'm going to go up to the screen, do this. Oh, look at that. It's because as soon as you're 2 feet back from the screen, most of what you were just complaining about is no longer relevant.
Well, it's definitely cool when you are 6 inches from the screen, when you can
it
see
is,
those 8K, but
it's a good way to objectively measure the differences between different display systems. Is it important? Absolutely, it's important and things like that. But I also have to, think about how these things are used in a real world environment, and who, reading this and stuff like that. And I think that, for the most part, the differences is, if it was grossly a problem at the screen, I would have put it in the review. If I had gone up to the screen, which I did, and measured it, and I'm like, oh my God, the pixel focus on this is awful, I would have said the pixel focus on this is awful. If the chromatic aberration was really bad, I would have mentioned it. If the convergence was really bad, and wasn't correctable, I would have mentioned it. If there's anything that I feel like is definitely an issue, I'll mention it.
So on that exact note, there was a question that was sent to answer, but I don't know if you saw it, Chris. Somebody was saying how to check for what they should be checking for if they get a projector about aberration and all that before the return window. Now, of course, that's up to the dealer you're working with in terms of the return window. But one of the things we suggest is when Kris, if you're having Kris and he can remote calibrate a projector.
I can QC it.
Kris will QC it and check out all that stuff. And if something is egregiously wrong, he will let you know. And I know if working with us, we will work with Kris and with JVC to swap that unit out if there are some issues.
Yeah. So, yes, there are units that have convergence issues, and yes, there are ones that have chromatic aberration issues. The thing about that is I think there's only been 2 JVCs I've ever worked on that actually needed to go back to the factory because the convergence was an issue. And I think it was something that, something went wrong in shipping. But it's extremely rare to see a convergence issue that can't be corrected just using their correction stuff. Chromatic aberration, the thing about that is that is going to vary directly based on your throw, how much lens shift you're using, and things like that. And then even then, the likelihood that the chromatic aberration is high enough that, again, from anything, more than just your nose at the screen is going to be a big problem. I just don't see it, within a reasonable tolerance. I don't know what JVC's tolerances would be on that either, where if I said, hey, here I am with my nose up at the screen and I see chromatic aberration, I want to return this. I don't know. Like, that's something you'd have to work either with the dealer or JVC directly, because I have no idea what the tolerance would be for that, but I try to be realistic about it. And again, most of the time it's just not really an issue.
Yeah. So the question, do you recommend turning off the 8K upscaler and projector and keep it on when using a Lumagen in a panel?
No, I don't. I would recommend trying it with it on, but you can ultimately at the end of the day, you can try it both ways. You can, it's not going to hurt either way, but I personally am using it with it on. So if you're asking like, what do I prefer? I'm using it. So
you're using the 8K upscaler
I am.
on top of the Lumagen, right? Which is what I would
Yeah.
be
So I
using.
have the Lumagen. Basically, any input source that goes into it is just being output as 4096 by 2160 because I'm using a DCR lens in my setup, and I have the 8K E-shift on.
Yeah, I'm skipping over this one. Does the auto option, the HDR level, rely on content metadata, as I've read, or is it based on its own analysis of the content?
So the auto is still doing its own analysis of the content. I think JVC actually does both. It does look at the metadata and uses that in some regards. And then it also is looking either on a scene by scene or frame by frame basis. So it is a mixture of both. I remember trying that a while back where I tricked it where I could change the metadata, and I did see that it did change it a bit. So I believe it uses both. I used the auto mode when I had it here, and I thought it worked really, really well more often than not. Like I didn't see any circumstances where I was like, oh, definitely don't want to use the auto and stuff like that. Evaluating moving content over time and stuff like that.
So
David asked the
Boulay
thing.
has a
Yeah, his 2.401, 140 inch. So, that's the same size screen that I have. I had an NX9 and I used it fine. NZ8 has more light output than an NX9 does. So an NZ8 should be fine on that size screen with that material. I don't see any reason why it, even without the anamorphic lens, you should still have plenty of light output, especially in high laser. Because again, you got to remember, like even the lowest version of these new ones has more light output than the NX9 did, by spec. So, yes, I recommend turning the Panasonic dynamic tone mapping off and just letting the NZ9 do it. Right. NZ9 has to be been tested, but based upon, do you think the rest of the NZ lineup will follow suit and being an upgrade? Yes, they're brighter. They are quieter. Again, like it all comes down to, what's the definition of an upgrade? As a lot of people have pointed out, I said that this was a modest upgrade over the NX9. I didn't, run down that road of like, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. It's so night and day that you always see, everybody do. It's just not what I do. The NX9 was already a fantastic projector. This uses the same core DLA chip and the same lens, and then has some, features like I didn't expect it to be something where I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this is, the next iteration of it. Is it better? Absolutely. I think if I did a side-by-side direct objective comparison between the two, the differences would probably be more standout than the way I did the review, where I just looked at the NZ, because I just think that most people don't sit there and look at two projectors at the same time. Most people either sold their old projector or took it down and put this one up. So you're not, you know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, I thought about it and I review things kind of, I'm hoping the way that most people would do it. Now, if somebody wanted me to do an objective side-by-side test, that's different. And I think the differences between the two would be more noticeable in that, it's always more noticeable when you do something side by side, but that's not how we watch things. It's really great if you're trying to do a direct comparison between two things, because it really puts it on an even keel. But for casual viewing, which is what most people do, that's just not a reality. So I think that this is an improved line over what they had before. I think the image looks spectacular. Last night I was watching something and I talked to somebody on the phone, and I had it on pause, and I was just like, man, the image on this just looks amazing. I was trying to find some content that might be, things that people would look at and stuff. But I was actually watching the sequel to Sin City, and that's pretty much all stark black and white with grays, and then it has these pops of color, and it just looked absolutely stunning the whole time I was watching that. And the fact that it was 1080p, I was just blown away at, with the scaling and everything like that. The image just looked phenomenal. I mean, I was sitting there like, man, I wish some people could come over and look at this.
I remember when I was out there looking, and we just had this still frame up from Pacific Rim, and it was the same thing.
Yeah, and I remember you kept saying something like, oh my God, that looks amazing. That whole sequence, I put Pacific Rim in there, because it's a nice test of like real dark and then some like mixed highlights and everything like that. And I remember you sitting there saying, like, oh my God, this just looks amazing, you know?
Yeah, I just
That
kept
was
saying
just,
it over and over. And again, that
yeah,
extra depth that you get, I think, from that improved contrast engine, and
yeah,
also the improved lens was just breathtaking, and it was
yeah.
just marveling at it.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to more people getting these out there. You know, I'm sure they're excited about getting them and stuff, but where it's not just, you know, like, oh, you know, Kris said it's only a little bit better and stuff. Well, Kris is, you know, I don't fly off the handle. You know, the NX
That's one
was
of the
already
things
a
I
great
love.
projector. Yeah, the
Yeah,
NX
because
was already
that's
a great projector. I've been living with the NX for a long time. It throws an amazing image. I'm looking at like what the prices have done on those, on, you know, some people getting rid of them or and stuff like that. I'm just like, my God, that's so much projector for those prices, you know,
yeah.
that most people would be blown away. I mean, that projector still outperforms just about everything on the market. So yes, it, you know, it is an improvement. It's a, you know, it has a lot more features. Obviously, it's a different usage case because of the laser, better contrast. You know, there's just a lot to like. It's just a refinement of what was there before.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
it's
a good
like
way to put
taking,
it, a
yeah,
refinement. And
yeah,
they
it's a
all
little
should
bit
be equally
brighter, a little bit
quiet.
refined. It's quieter. You know, it's a great projector. So
So somebody's asking, what do you mean remote calibrate? Because you do a fair number of those. So if
yeah,
you
I
could just,
do a lot, especially during COVID. So a remote calibration is, you know, you ship the projector to me, or your dealer, say you ordered one from the screening room or somebody else, they can ship it to me before it comes to you. I emulate your setup. So I basically put it in my theater, which is a lot like a lab. John's been in my room. It's, you know, it's basically a big black pit.
yep.
And I set up the projector so that it is the same distance from the screen as you have there, the same zoom for the image size that you have. And then I use whatever screen material you're using. I have literally boxes. I'm looking up here of screen materials and stuff, so that I'm measuring off the same screen material that you're using, and I calibrate it for your usage case. You know, I find out what you're using. You know, are you using an outboard video processor? I can incorporate that into there, something like a Lumagen or whatever. I can't do a Mad VR, but I could do with a Lumagen. Whether you're using a lens, I could put a DCR lens on it, and I can basically calibrate it so that it arrives at your house with the calibration intact. It is different than if I came in your room, because I can't sit there and do any kind of fine adjustments to your install, you know, your alignment of your lens and things like that. But in terms of like the gamma, color, grayscale, all those things will be, pretty much identical to what you would have got had I been in your room. I don't charge quite as much for that service as I do if I go out on site, because I know I can't do some of the alignment things that I would do when I'm in play. But it just gives an option for people that, I'm not going to be touring that area anytime soon, or, for me to go out and tour, that area, or to fly out just for that job, is cost prohibitive. I'm just trying to give a solution for a lot of people that, just I can't get out there, or they don't, or whatever. It's just another option for you. And like I said, if it's sent from a dealer to me directly, new in box, it gives me the opportunity to do a quality check on it to see if there's anything about it that I think, you might need to return it or anything like that. I have had to do that with a few units, but it's thankfully not been very many.
Yeah, we recommend. I mean, it's one of those things. It's at the preference of the purchase person buying, but we always recommend it because Kris has, like he says, almost every screen material known to humankind, and
Yeah,
can
and if they
simulate it
have
and
one
get
that
it
I don't
awful
have, I
close.
try to get it.
Yep.
I've had a few people that had some obscure ones, and I just say, hey, I don't have that one, but I reach out and I get it. I just, in fact, today, where is it? Last week I got a bunch here from Silver Ticket, because Silver Ticket had a few that I didn't have. So I got everything that they have now in here. So I try to make sure I have pretty much all of the more known ones, but every once in a while somebody gets something obscure. The only one I don't like doing remote with a screen is I do not like doing the daylight high power screens remotely. The reason is those are extremely sensitive to the angle of the projector to the screen itself, and then the way your head is to it. So if somebody was looking for a remote calibration and they have a high power screen, I'll do it if you want me to do it, but I would prefer to do that on site simply because of the limitations of that screen, like the way it's designed to work. It's not a very good screen for remote. Do I personally use P3 filter? Yes, I do. I've been using more often than not. I was using it. I've actually for the last 2 weeks been not using it just to see how much difference I'd notice. I do a little bit, but you know, I could honestly go either way. You know, if I have the light, I have no problem using the filter. But honestly, even without the filter, I haven't really noticed anything that I've been like, color looks off on that. I noticed more difference in the color when I'm looking at test montages and stuff. Like JVC's got an HDR test disc, the Spears and Munzel montage, like some of the stuff that kind of pushes the gamut a little bit more. Some of that stuff I notice it more because I'm used to the way it looks with the filter, but in most content I don't really notice about. Is the auto HDR option adaptive to content or just adaptive to the optimizer setting? The auto HDR option is basically the JVC deciding on what compression level they're going to use. Tone mapping is a form of compression. You're compressing the high dynamic range signal down to a lower dynamic range. So like even with the existing NX, if you choose low, medium, or high, as you go from low to high, the image overall will be brighter. Think about it as like pop music versus classical music. There's less separation between any one element. So it's louder all the time with less separation between anything in it. So in compression for video, everything will be brighter. There'll be less differentiation between the items in the image because you're trying to just basically make it all brighter in terms of like the overall. Whereas if you go down to the low setting, you're allowing for more dynamic range. So the image will look darker because you have to preserve headroom for the highlights. So the auto HDR option that they've added now, again, has more granularity. There's not 3 levels, there's 5. And then it's auto selecting what it thinks would be the best one to preserve the dynamic range based on what your settings are. But if you like it a little brighter, you can go in and manually select that and leave it at that. So how do you compare the NZ9 to a low-end Barco like the F90? I don't know if I've seen an F90. The last Barco direct comparison I did was an NX9 versus a Barco Braggy. We did a controlled test with that where the Barco rep was even there. And the Barco looked great, but we couldn't find anything where we thought it looked better than the JVC did. The NX9 was there. This was actually for a client that was considering buying one or the other. He didn't end up buying either. He's got a Sony 885 and he was like, I might wait and see what JVC's got it coming out. But he thought that everybody that was there pretty much preferred the JVC. Like the Barco looked great. They looked more similar than not most of the time. And then the JVC would stand out because of the contrast whenever we watched anything dark. But that guy looked at content for like 2 hours, everything from like planet Earth kind of stuff to dark, you know, like sci-fi stuff and everything in between. I mean, he was just sitting there just going between tons and tons of content. And everybody pretty much agreed that there wasn't anything where the Barco stood out as looking better than the JVC, but there was a lot of content that the JVC looked noticeably better because of the dynamic range. But Barco looked great, but you know, it had the same limitations that I typically see from a lot of DLPs in that it has the, you know, just it doesn't have enough contrast in it. I was actually thinking that I would see more difference in the motion between the two, but I didn't really notice that even with a lot of fast moving stuff. We didn't look at any sports though. So
yeah, and just going to throw this out there real quick before we have one question left in here. It's the last chance to throw any questions in. If somehow we missed your question, if you want to resubmit it, but we're getting close to wrap up time here. But we have one question in there. So if your question had not been answered and for some reason, throw it back out there, but do it quick. Go ahead, Kris.
Yeah, JVC has said the laser would be replaceable. Yeah, I think they said that early on. I haven't heard anything more about that. Maybe at some point they will. It is replaceable in the fact that like if you have something wrong with it or something, it can be replaced. If you were thinking about it more in the line of like, you know, like a bulb usage where like, hey, I want to be able to just replace it. I don't really know if it's designed around that usage case. I mean, again, the laser does, lower in light output over time, but it's extremely slow to do so. So unless you're starting off where you need like 100% of the light output of this projector right from the get-go, which if that was the case, I probably would say it's probably not the right projector for you. You should have some headroom in it. I don't think I don't know. I think that's I've seen a lot of people talk about that. I just don't know if that's going to be a problem. The 4500, I have seen some one-off cases where they lost, more light than they would have liked to, but for the most part, I'm not really seeing that. I haven't seen that from the Sony projectors. I've seen where they have contrast lost and some gamma shifting, but light output hasn't really been dropping that much. And I mean, if you were looking at this as like, hey, I plan on owning this for all 20,000 hours or something, maybe that'd be different. But yeah. So do I use a 3D LUT when calibrating with a Radiance Pro in the video chain? Yes and no. I use a 3D LUT if it's necessary for a 3D LUT. When I do a Radiance calibration in my own system, I use 2020 color for everything. And I have the Lumagen convert that to 709. So if I'm watching something 709, so in that case, I actually do use a 3D LUT for the color conversion. When I'm looking at P3 or 2020 color, I haven't found that I need to use a 3D LUT with the Radiance Pro in mine. I've done tons of 3D LUTs in my own room and on lots of clients and stuff like that. I'm not opposed. I mean, obviously that's a great tool, but it is a tool. So I use it if it needs to be used, but I'm not one of those people that just thinks that, oh, you have the ability to do a 3D LUT, you should do a 3D LUT. If you don't need it, if the error rate doesn't really support it, I just don't see the point in applying more processing in there. I've had that conversation with quite a few people. So yes, I have a 3D LUT in mine up there for my 709 playback. I don't for my P3 playback. But I have used it in the past and stuff like that. I don't have a problem with it. So.
Well, that gets through the questions. I did one of the things, just going to want to cover a couple of things before we wrap up. Was there anything else that you felt was left out, Kris, that you really wanted to hit?
No, the only thing that a concern, since there's some people here, a lot of them probably either bought or getting it. One concern I do have with the JVC, I didn't talk about it in the review because I didn't really have any examples of it specifically, except for one usage case, is HDMI. JVC has, as I mentioned in the beginning, I've had quite a few firmware updates from them. The latest one that I got, which is probably what's in the shipping one, was to address an HDMI problem that they were having, I think, with Marantz AVRs or processors. Their AVR, their audio processor. I don't know what the HDMI issue was. When I first got the unit, I would see some flashing as it synced between one signal and another. Usually like the JVCs just go to black and you'll see it like kind of go between like different levels of black and then you get the signal back. I would see something like some green or some white flashes and it was intermittent. Sometimes they do it, sometimes it wouldn't. And that was something that they addressed with a later HDMI output changed. Now it doesn't really do that, but when using the Radiance with the latest firmware, I get an occasional glitch that's like a purple or a pink flash that happens for like once, like not even a frame probably. And it happens sporadically. It might happen once or maybe twice a movie. This has something to do with the changes that they made to their HDMI input. Because if I load an older firmware, it doesn't do it at all. I could, use it for days on without any problem. And then if I go back to the newer firmware, I might see again this glitch every once in a while. I didn't see it in my testing when I was connecting other sources directly to it. But the problem is that, like, for example, the newest firmware, I think I used the projector. I have version like 1.2 right now. And I think it took like 4 days before it it was I think 2 to 4 days. I can't remember how many before I ever saw a glitch. So, if I just, and that's with like watching it for a few hours each of those days. So, it's one of those things that like, if I went in right now and tested it with an Oppo, I could spend 2 hours and it won't happen, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't happen tomorrow, or whatever. It is an HDMI 2.1 input, and almost every display manufacturer that's implemented a 2.1 input, which is very few, and I think some AVRs have all had some little HDMI hiccups, where you've seen them, continuously put out firmware and things like that. I just don't, that's the only thing that I just don't know how that's going to play out, when more of these get out in the field and people are connecting more sources to it that are sources I don't have or whatever. If this HDMI input is very sensitive to little differences, maybe from the cable, to, the EQing in the signal, any kind of thing like that, if it's throwing a glitch every once in a while, I'm sure, JVC is obviously, aware that this has happened because they've already, given me an update for another device, but I'm sure that they, as more people get these, if it becomes a running problem, we'll see updates. Again, I have firmware that, doesn't do it at all. So I know it's something that can be fixed because obviously it doesn't do it. But there's a chance that, depending on stuff like that, over time, we'll have to see how stable the HDMI is. And again, that, we've seen that with every device that has had an HDMI 2.1 input. It's just, different, it's different EQing and everything like that. It's a different bandwidth and stuff like that. The brand of cable I'm using in my setup, when I was doing all my testing, I used a couple different ones actually. Most of the time I used a Monoprice slimline 4K one. It's what I've used in my system for a long time. Haven't had any problems with it. When I did all my 8K testing, I used some cables that AV Pro had sent me. They were the bullet train ones. And I used that whenever I was doing any 8K testing from like the Meridio, because they had sent me a Meridio 8K pattern generator. So I used a 48 gigabit per second cable for that. Right now I'm using a Tributaries UHDV, which is their premium fiber one that has like a little USB thing with their own little power pack for it. So all of the Monoprice and the Tributaries were both fiber. The AV Pro Edge ones that I used, because I was just going from a pattern generator, were standard cable, just coax cable or whatever.
And just I would throw out there too, since I talk to Kris pretty often. Kris gives lots of great feedback from the field about which cables are working, which aren't, and also Jim at Lumagen. And it's interesting, we usually end up with Tributaries or Monoprice cables when we're doing stuff.
I will say this, if you're not using an 8K source or a 4K 120 source, so if you're going to buy one of these projectors and you're just using the same stuff you had before, a Blu-ray player, an Apple TV, all of those kind of things like that are 4K based, I would just stick with 4K based cables, 18 gigabits cables. I did notice that if I tried to use some of the 8K cables I had with a 4K source, I was getting some issues with that. And I don't know if that has to do with, again, you're talking about a different EQ, you're talking about a couple different things that if it doesn't apply to the content you're sending, you're probably safer using a 4K cable instead of an 8K cable. Your results may vary, but unless you're going to be feeding, those signals, I would recommend just staying with a 4K cable that has worked in the past for you.
Yeah.
So
staying out of the wild west that HDMI has often been, right?
Right.
So,
right.
So I have some general stuff I was going to throw out there, unless you had anything else specific you wanted to
Nope.
throw out.
No, I think I covered everything.
Yeah. So again, last chance to throw out any questions here, but we're coming up on almost 2 hours, and I just kind of wanted to say, we always enjoy listening to Kris, always learn from Kris. We obviously got really deep into the technical here, but obviously the crowd we had, judging from the questions, really appreciates that. I'm just going to throw out a little bit about us at the screening room. We like to get into the weeds with that kind of thing, and we care about what really matters. And talking to Kris, it keeps us honest in terms of stuff, and we're always again checking marketing claims against real world performance. And of course, there's plenty of places you can buy JVC projectors. We're hoping you'll give us a shot. Hopefully you see the kind of level of information we try to provide and our approach here. And then, like I said, we often use Kris for remote calibrations, or when he's in town, he comes out and does quite a few. We're in Colorado, but we do have a national presence. So please give us a shot, especially if you found all the information that was shared here tonight valuable. Again, that kind of shows you our approach. Here's our information up on the screen. The only other thing I was going to ask, just going to talk about, we're planning on doing another one of these with Bill Hunt of the Digital Bits, with me and Kris and Bill Hunt, talking about the state of media. We'll talk about Kaleidoscape. We'll talk about physical discs, which are kind of on their way out, versus streaming, and kind of do some myth busting around streaming versus Kaleidoscape versus disc, and just have a general conversation about the state of source content. So that's coming up probably in January. I talked to Bill Hunt last night. If anybody doesn't go to digitalbits.com, that's probably the best site I know of to get information for video reviews and the state of what Hollywood is doing, and streaming, physical media. And Kris and I also are very partial to Kaleidoscape, which is something we'll be talking about in the near future. So again, that's our approach. If you're interested in that kind of thing, we'll be doing some more of these. And thank you for participating and throwing your questions out there, or just listening in. We really appreciate your time. Kris, did you have anything else?
No, thanks to everybody that came in. I hope I answered the questions that you wanted. Always appreciate, being able to talk about this stuff. For the guys that are getting these, looking forward to seeing, what everybody else thinks about them. I've kind of been in a vacuum because I'm the only one that has it. So I am looking forward to seeing more people out there, and, hopefully they're not saying, I was full of it.
No, well, people are saying this was superb. Thank you. So I love it. Again, to get the amount of technical geekery we get into on here, and the fact that we can keep up with it, I think says something. And so, yeah, again, thank you, Kris, for taking the time out of your evening, and everybody else. Some people on the East Coast are almost at 10 o'clock now. This was great. I love doing these things, and I always learn something.
All right. Everybody have a great night. Hope to meet or talk to you guys in the future.
Good night, everybody.